Hey everybody, welcome to Tech Tickle. On today's episode, we're going to be taking a full retrospective look at every Pascal release that's come out in the last 6 months or so, and we're going to be comparing those to previous NVIDIA releases and seeing exactly how it performed when compared to the competition. If that sounds like a lot of information, it fucking was, so please stay tuned so I didn't do this for nothing. Okay, so first things first, there's one thing you need to understand before we begin. The question we're trying to answer here is, just how far forward did NVIDIA push the envelope? Is this the biggest butt thrust they've ever given us, or have they done better in the past? Now, to really answer that question, it's important that we have a fundamental understanding of what Pascal is. But I'm not the guy who's going to do that for you, because frankly, Tom's Hardware and AnonTech and all those guys have gone into great detail about exactly what is under the hood of your brand new 1080, 1070, or 1060. So there's no need to rehash that here. But suffice it to say that Pascal essentially is just Maxwell shrunk down. The IPC is the same. The insular nature of the FinFET process has actually allowed for higher clocks, which is where the majority of the performance benefit comes from, with the rest coming from higher transistor density and more CUDA cores per square millimeter. Now that we understand that, let's look at some graphs. This one might be a little daunting, so let me walk you through it. We are in this graph comparing the performance of a given GPU to the size of the die. So we have grouped all of these major releases into rough size groups. So small dies are roughly 230 millimeters squared. Cut middle dies are the first cut down version of the 350 to 400 square millimeter die. The middle dies in the third chart are the fully unlocked versions of the same die mentioned in section 2. And lastly, in the fourth column, or row I guess it would be, we have big dies, which are roughly 500 to 600 millimeters squared. And I threw in the Titan XP for reference, even though it doesn't really fit, and I'll explain why in a second. So as you can see by this chart, each of the 4 last generations are represented, with Fermi 2.0 being counted as its own and Kepler's 1 and 2.0 releases being smushed together because we both know that was bullshit. So before we get too deep into it, let me just give you an idea of how this chart works. So the GTX 550 Ti seen in the first blue section in the first row is 28% better than the GPU that it was intended to replace at the same die size on the NVIDIA side of things, of course. So that was the GTS 450 for those of you unaware, and the GTX 550 Ti was 28% better than that. So moving on to the GTX 660, which followed, it was 108% better than the 550 Ti. So that's how this chart works. With every chunk you go up, you're comparing that generation to the previous release on the same die size. You get it? So the most interesting thing about this chart for me is in the first row. The small dies, the 230 millimeter square-ish dies that have happened over the last 4 generations have come the furthest collectively, as you can see by the total length of the bar. Generation over generation, these things are making the biggest leap collectively, and it is a sight to see. Now, the reasons for these are many. There are all sorts of engineering reasons I could supply to you right now as to why these chips are moving ahead faster than their bigger brothers, but that's not really the focus of this video. What we're trying to better understand is the economic incentive behind these targets that NVIDIA is setting for itself generation over generation. And the reasoning is this. Smaller dies are cheaper to produce and easier to sell with larger margins. How do I know this? Well, for one, wafer utilization is higher when the die is smaller. And it's pretty simple to understand. Imagine you got a circle, and I told you that you had to put as many squares of the same size into that circle as you possibly can. The larger percentage of that circle you use, the higher your score in this little game. What size square would you use? Would you use a big square where a lot of the edges are wasted, or would you use a nice tiny little infinitesimally small square that you can fit a whole bunch of into this circle so that when you assemble them they actually look like a circle and the edges are practically smooth? Obviously you'd go with the smaller one. That's the better option. Secondly, we can infer from pricing and historical precedent that the amount of fully enabled chips to come out of this die size is much higher than its bigger cousins. Now we can, in part at least, infer this from the price differential of the products. So a 1080, for example, carries a much higher premium over its 1070 cousin, but the 1066 gigabyte compared to the 1063 gigabyte is much more reasonable. That implies that a higher percentage of the yield that came from the wafer was fully enabled. You get it? Also, it seems, again, based on historical precedent, that the amount of gimping they have to do to get a big chip to work and become a 1070 is a lot deeper than what they have to do to a 1060 to make it work. So a 1070, by comparison, is pretty much missing an arm or a leg. It's got about a quarter of it disabled, as where the 1063GB over the 1066GB has a few fingers missing. And lastly, they are easier to sell because they are cheaper. NVIDIA has every incentive to make these the new mainstream standard, replacing cards like the 970 and 1070 in future generations because of the two aforementioned reasons. What inevitably we kind of have to accept is that enthusiasts only make up a small percentage of the market, and that includes 1070 buyers. Even that card is a bit expensive for most people's palates. As such, the 1060 is just a much easier sell, which is exactly why they were quick to release it once AMD had put out the RX 480. Another interesting thing that really jumps out at you with this chart is that the green and the yellow bars representing Kepler and Pascal technologies, respectively, are a lot larger than their purple counterparts, with the exception of one card being the GTX 970. Now, why is this? Well, it comes down to one word, and that's called parallelism. You see, CPUs have a set number of cores, and as the process node that they are built upon shrinks, the core sizes shrink, and unless you increase core count, the CPU, in terms of multi-threaded workload, isn't going to get any better, or at least not a lot better. Which is why you get these incremental 4 to 6% improvements in performance generation over generation from Intel. But on the GPU side, parallelism is the act of a lot of little monkeys in a room writing the same book. And if you put enough of them in the room at the same time, they're going to write a novel. And if you get smaller monkeys into the room instead of big giant baboons, you're going to be able to fit more monkeys in. And they all have 10 fingers, and they all have typewriters, really tiny typewriters, but anyway, I don't know where I'm going with this, but the bottom line is what I'm trying to say is the more stuff you can fit on the same size chip, the better it will perform. And that's precisely why Kepler and Pascal have been so successful, while Maxwell, which was merely an architectural improvement on the same node, ended up performing admirably for what it was, but fell a bit short by comparison. Also, before we move on, I will say that the GTX 970, as you can see by this graph, was quite the little performer. 56% higher than its GTX 670 counterpart. Kind of sticks out like a sore thumb on this chart. Now, why did that happen? Well, it actually all stems from the 3.5GB fiasco. You see, that was a mistake on NVIDIA's part, but not because they made the change to the card. It was because they didn't advertise it clearly in the first place. See, what they should have done, instead of just sort of letting customers stumble upon it themselves months after they bought their card, is come out and said, hey, we could have disabled an entire block of SMMs like they did with the 1070, but instead we chose to leave bits of it working. As a result, it will access the memory that it's connected to a little bit slower, and the last bit of VRAM that you go to fill is not going to fill as fast as the first 3.5GB. But on the plus side, you're going to get a much bigger boost in performance overall because of what we've done. Engineering magic, yada yada yada. One last thing I should point out before I move on is that the Titan XP was included here as a filler for the 1080 Ti, which you can expect sometime around Christmas or later, depending on when Vega rumblings start to happen. NVIDIA usually has a habit of holding back until AMD looks like they're actually going to put up a fight. Anyhow, what's really deliciously notable about it is that it is 470 millimeters squared in size, which is a whole 130-ish millimeters squared less than previous big dies on older architectures. That would make this NVIDIA's first foray into this die size. Hawaii GPUs from a few years ago on the AMD side, the R9 290, 290X, and so forth, were about this size, but this would be a first for NVIDIA. GP100, the true king daddy of them all, is being reserved for the non-consumer market space with dedicated HBM2. So don't expect to see that in a graphics card unless AMD starts to put up a bit of a fight. And speaking of, let's move on to the competition and see what kind of a lead, if any, NVIDIA had over AMD throughout the past 3 generations prior to Pascal. I tried desperately to get this into chart form, but I just couldn't manage it. I'm not really much of an Excel guy, so this is what I did instead. And I'm going to try to walk you through it to make you better understand it. So let's take the GTX 580 for example. So when the GTX 580 came out, the card that it was designed to replace at the same price point was the Radeon 5870 2GB, or the iFinity as it was called at the time. And it ended up besting it by 25%, which is the first green number you see immediately to the right of the competing card. The third column of cards is the card that AMD responded with as long as it was within a reasonable amount of time. So I wanted to give AMD a fair shake here. So whenever they would respond within about a month or two with another competing card of their own, or an improvement on a pre-existing card, I included that as well just to give you a bit of perspective. And as you can see, the Fermi generation was pretty much a clean sweep in terms of price performance, but it came at a significant cost to NVIDIA. You see, AMD had been going small since about the 4000 series, and their die sizes on average were a full 30 to 50% smaller than NVIDIA at the same retail price points. So as I'm sure you've been able to deduce by now, this resulted in a higher per unit profitability for AMD and much deeper margins, which is the key thing you want to do when you're trying to impress shareholders at a shareholders meeting. In other words, NVIDIA's strong competitor wanted to remain dominant in the market space, but they did so at a great cost. By the time Terascale 3 came out with the Radeon 6000 series, things did even out a little bit. The 6970 provided new competition for the 570, and the 550 Ti got virtually butt-fucked by the 6790. But it wasn't until the 28 nanometer era that things would really start to heat up, with both companies going blow for blow with one another for the better part of 2 years. And speaking of the 28 nanometer era, it began with AMD taking the first swipe at NVIDIA with the Radeon 7970 and 7950, both of which beat the GTX 580 handily and firmly, but not by a particularly wide margin. But the bottom line is it opened up the door for some ample competition, and that's exactly what NVIDIA responded with their mid-sized die, the GTX 680, and the cut-down version, the 670, each of which handily beat their AMD cousins. Of course, AMD did not sit still. They fired back by upping the clocks of those two respective cards to actually bring them over and above their competitors once again. And the 7970 GHz edition stood as king for a while before the 780 came along and beat the shit out of it by 20%, and was itself beaten down by the R9 290 and 290X. The 290 had a 4% gain, as you can see by the little red number next to it, over its competing card at the time, but the 780 Ti came out a mere 4 days after that to take back the crown by 9 full points over the 290X. On the bottom end, the 660 Ti was beating the 7870 handily by 9 points, while the 660, which was one of the most popular graphics cards ever made, was handily beating the 7850 by a whopping 16 points. So Kepler was definitely a plus for NVIDIA. Die sizes had gotten smaller, they were supremely competitive over AMD, and the crunch was really starting to be felt by the smaller company. And then of course came Maxwell, which was completely dominating in a whole new way. The 980 slapped the 290X around, the 970 bested the 290, all of these on much smaller die sizes, by the way. The 960 actually lost to the R9 285 on release and was beaten even more badly by the R9 380 later, which was actually a bit of a failure for NVIDIA, but the 950 handily beat the R7 370. So overall, Maxwell was really well received. The 980 Ti was the real story though. The R9 Fury actually came out after the 980 Ti did. The 980 Ti ended up being a preemptive response to all the rumblings happening around Fiji and HBM, and it turns out it was a winner. Although the gap has shrunk considerably since. It's no longer a 14-point win for the 980 Ti. With drivers and whatnot, and Pascal and DirectX 12, the Fury X is finding itself with a new home, especially at 4K. Taking a page out of the 7970 GHz edition and 7950 Boost edition book, they took the 290 and 290X, upclocked them a bit, and refreshed them as the 390 and 390X, which allowed AMD to stay competitive during that time, losing slightly with the 390X, but winning slightly with the 390, but all to no real impact in terms of market share. Their total share in the market space was less than 20% by then, and things started to look really dire leading up to Pascal, which is where we stand today. And as you can see, there is nothing on the chart. The 1080 and 1070 stand alone above the RX 480 with no real competition in that performance range. Now, to be fair to AMD, they are doing the right thing. They are the smaller company. They have to kind of hedge their bets and put their money where they know they can grow, and that is at the low to mid end of the spectrum. By leading with Polaris 10, they were able to have free run of the mid-range market for a while, but they really weren't expecting NVIDIA to have the 1060 ready so fast, as well as the 1063GB edition, which competes directly with the RX 470, which really didn't have the free run of the market in the same way that the 480 did. Oh, that's a lot of information to absorb, I know, and I'm kind of shoving it down your throat like a porn star with an equation tattooed on his dick, but bear with me because we're almost done. The number that you really need to know is 33%. Now, what does 33 represent in this context? That is the margin by which the 1080 is beating the Fury X, which is still the strongest AMD card on the market. Has this ever happened before? Has NVIDIA ever had a lead that big? And the answer is no. Not even once, not even close. And worse yet, the Fury X is a 600 square millimeter die compared to the 1080, which is a mere 314 square millimeters. AMD, once the king of small, the king of efficiency, has become a bloated mess, and they desperately need to catch up, or else we are going to continue to see $700 fucking X80 cards. Non-competition is what breeds higher prices. For all of you people who are complaining about MSRP prices being low compared to actual retail prices all around the world, you have a right to complain, but it is not at NVIDIA that you should be shouting. Business gonna biz. They're in the business of making money. Can't be blamed for taking advantage of a non-competitive market space. The people you should be screaming at are the people at AMD who haven't given you a product you want to buy in years. So what do we know about Pascal? Well, it's pretty great. And how is it great? Well, it's great because of the insular nature of the FinFET process that allows for higher clocks. Otherwise, it's the exact same architecture as Maxwell with the same ICP and a slightly higher transistor density. Formula for success when you have no competition in the market space. Anyway, that's it for this video. Follow me at OFA on Twitter, and stay tuned. I got a lot of interesting things coming. I got a collaboration with Nerd on a Budget that's taking place right now, and that sometime around Christmas will make its debut. I'll be all over the place. Just pay attention to my Twitter, and I'll be around. So, till next time.